Hi there, and welcome to another Mr. Carter Science Special. This video is primarily aimed at the AQA GCSE Biology course, but it will also be applicable to many other biology courses for the GCSE and International GCSE specification. This video covers the B18 chapter 18.9 and 18.8 Trophic levels and biomass. As always, keep your eyes open for the learning outcomes and the syllabus references. Here's a quick starter activity for you. Explain what's meant by the term trophic level. Pause the video, write down what you think the answer is. So what is the answer? Well, trophic levels such as producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers describe an organism's place in the food chain. In fact, this will be a 2-mark answer in an exam. If you said the different names of trophic levels and then said that they describe an organism's place in a food chain, you could easily pick up 2 marks there. And we've got an example of a food chain here below, where the producer is the cabbage, primary consumer is the rabbit, the secondary consumer is the stoat, and the tertiary consumer is the fox. In fact, in a food chain, the food chain shows us where the energy and in fact the biomass goes. In other words, what gets eaten by what. The arrows are incredibly important because they show where the energy is going. So a food chain really shows you the flow of energy from one organism into the next. That's what those arrows are showing you. The producer will always be a plant, because a plant will use photosynthesis to convert the sun's energy into food, in fact into biomass molecules like glucose, which is then converted into lipids and proteins and starches. In this food chain, we can now see that the scientists have been out there and they've used a variety of techniques to measure the number of each species within the food chain. And we can see that the number of each organisms in each stage, in each trophic level, is less than the previous stage. So we've got 4 cabbages and then 3 rabbits, 2 stoats and 1 fox. They are decreasing as we move further along the food chain. In fact, we could use that information to draw a pyramid of numbers like this below, and it shows the same pattern. However, if we looked at a different food chain, here with just the 1 tree, and then we've got many green fly, fewer ladybirds, and just 1 bird at the top, we get this funny looking pyramid where it doesn't have the classic shape. In fact, it's more like a Christmas tree perhaps. It's a very strange and funny looking pyramid. And that can sometimes happen when we're only looking at pyramids of number. So a pyramid of number doesn't always reflect what's going on within the food chain. Perhaps a better measurement would be to look at biomass. So when we measure biomass, biomass is the mass of material in a living organism. And biomass is measured in grams or kilograms. And there are 2 types of biomass that can be measured: wet biomass and dry biomass. So biomass is created when a plant converts the sun's light energy into chemical energy trapped in the bonds of biological molecules like glucose and starch and fats and proteins. And this biomass is created via photosynthesis, and then it's passed along the food chain. So measuring biomass is a very useful way of looking at feeding relationships. And we can see from the photos below here that we've got some plants that are very good at producing biomass indeed. For example, here we've got some incredibly fast growing bamboo shoots that can easily grow a number of inches per week, and they can really shoot up many meters high. Here you can see measuring the size or comparing the size of this giant redwood tree in America to the size of the children below at the base, and these trees can grow to many tens of meters tall. And just consider how many kilograms of biomass will be in both of these particular species. So how do we measure this biomass? Well, we've got two measurements we could use. Wet biomass, which involves measuring the mass in living organisms, organisms that are alive during the measurement process, or dry biomass. Now, the big advantage of wet biomass is that the organisms that you're measuring are alive, but it's a less reliable measurement than the drier biomass, because the amount of water in a living organism can vary throughout the day and depending on environmental conditions. This makes it harder to repeat the measurement and produce the same results, so it's far less reliable. So scientists often choose to use the far more reliable dry biomass measurement. Now, dry biomass involves measuring the mass in an organism that has recently been killed. Samples are then placed in an oven or an incubator and dried out for several hours. The samples are then removed to cool and the mass measured. They're then placed back in the oven and the procedure is repeated until you get 3 measurements of dry biomass that are exactly the same. Then you know that you have evaporated off all the water that was in the living organism. This makes a dry biomass sample a more reliable measurement than wet biomass. It's easier to repeat the measurement and reproduce the same results. And when you use biomass, in particular dry biomass, to look at the pyramids of biomass, then you will find that always a pyramid of biomass will always have the same shape. It will always be a traditional pyramid. And this is because the number of organisms usually decreases along the food chain, because 90% of the energy and the biomass is lost from one trophic level to the next. The energy and the biomass is lost as movement and heat and respiration. It's lost in uneaten food, in feces, in excretion of urea or excretion of carbon dioxide and sweat. You are losing biological molecules all the time. So even in the example of the tree that we saw earlier, we would have that same pyramid would be a huge producer at the base of the pyramid, because it's a large amount of biomass in the tree. So the biomass, as we've said, of each trophic level is always less than the previous trophic level. And this is because not all organisms or parts of the organism are eaten by the next consumer. Some biomass that is consumed by the next level on the trophic, the next consumer on the trophic level, is passed out and lost as waste material, feces or water, urea and urine. A large amount of biomass is used in respiration and converted into energy for the organism to use on the 7 life processes, for example, movement or reproduction. Again, this is energy and biomass that can't be passed on to the next trophic level. Only a small amount of energy is used in growth to build new biomass, and it's that small amount of energy and small amount of biomass that's produced that can be passed on to the next trophic level, typically around 10%, although that figure can vary wildly depending on the food chains that you're looking at. Here we've got an example of some of the ways in which biomass can be lost in urine, or lost in feces, or lost in movement. But here you can see the biomass going in as food, but some of it, in fact a large amount, is lost in cellular reproduction. There's only a small amount which is turned into new horse biomass that can be passed on along the food chain. So we need to consider in a little bit more detail each of the ways that biomass is lost. So if we lose biomass in feces, then some of that biomass is ingested by a consumer and it cannot be used by the consumer and therefore cannot be passed on to the next trophic level. For example, cellulose in plant cell walls often can't be digested. So even though the consumer, for example a cow or a horse or even ourselves, has eaten it, has ingested that cellulose, that fibre, it cannot be broken down by our enzymes, so it can't be absorbed by our bodies, it can't be used for growth, and it can't be passed on to the next level of the food chain, the next trophic level. And that's because we animals often lack the enzyme cellulase needed to break down that cellulose. So the fibrous material is digested or pooped out as feces and so not passed on to the next trophic level. Carnivores will mainly eat meat or protein, which can be digested by protease enzymes. So carnivores need to eat less often than a herbivore and so produce less feces than the herbivore. But carnivores cannot eat or break down 100% of their prey. So things like the hooves, the claws, the bones and the teeth are often left uneaten. Or if eaten, they will pass out in the feces. Again, this is biomass that cannot pass from the primary consumer to the secondary consumer into the carnivore and get passed on to the next trophic level. Another method where biomass is lost to the next trophic level is with excretion of waste. For example, when too much protein is eaten, the excess amino acids are deanimated and broken down by the liver to form urea. Now, if you want to see this in detail, I have a video on osmoregulation that you could watch where we talk about the process of the liver tearing off the nitrogen and 2 hydrogen atoms from an amino acid to form ammonia and then instantly converting that into urea. The urea is then removed by the kidneys and stored in the bladder along with some excess water as urine, and then that is excreted whenever you go to the toilet. Again, this urea is a biological molecule that cannot be passed on to the next trophic level, therefore the biomass contained cannot be passed on. Another example comes from glucose. Glucose is taken in by a consumer but often used in respiration, and this releases and produces carbon dioxide and water, which are then excreted either through urination or by exhaling and breathing out carbon dioxide and water. And again, these biomass in the biological molecules cannot be passed on to the next trophic level. In particular, the glucose is not stored as fat and so can't be passed on. And the energy contained in the glucose is lost as heat to the environment or used for the life processes, movement, etc. And again, so can't be passed on. So this is energy that you have consumed as an organism, but is not passed on to the next trophic level. Biomass can also be lost in thermoregulation. Warm-blooded exothermic animals need to maintain a constant internal body temperature that is higher than the temperature of the surrounding environment. Heat energy from respiration is used in this process of thermoregulation, so biomass, the glucose used in respiration, is not passed on to the next trophic level. Due to this process, many mammals and birds need to eat a lot more than fish, reptiles and amphibians to achieve the same increase in biomass during growth. Another thing to consider when considering the lost biomass in food chains are the decomposers. Decomposers do not appear on a pyramid of numbers or a pyramid of biomass. However, decomposers do break down biomass, feces and dead organisms, and decomposers probably contain more biomass than all of the other organisms combined. I hope you've enjoyed watching this video on trophic levels and biomass. Please comment below, let me know what you've learnt, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you very much for watching this video.